So let's start. In this class, I'll just be giving an overview of the work, and I'll be start with talking a bit about Proclus's life,
Mhm.
and the next time we'll start going through the text. So the text is called Elements of Theology, and it's by Proclus, right? So Proclus was born in 412 of the Common Era and died in 485. The sources that we have for his life are, on the one hand, the biography, which is actually a kind of hagiography of his student Marinus,
Okay.
who might interest you to know was originally a Samaritan, and who converted to the worshiping the Greek gods at some point. And also Damascus, the last head of the Platonic Academy, who was head of the Platonic Academy when it was shut down in 527. He also writes about Proclus in this work that's reached us in a fragmentary form called the Philosophical History, which is like a picture of the Greek pagan intellectuality at the time. And and so those are the two. There are also some archaeological finds. People think that they have found there's something that might be Proclus's house,
Okay.
and the academy in Athens, and also there's a tombstone that was found that belonged to his teacher Syrianus. But let me explain a bit more about who are these people by giving a brief overview of his life. So he was born in Constantinople. So it was already a Christianizing Roman Empire. There were still some pagans working in the imperial bureaucracy. There were even still some temples, but actively functioning. Although in Proclus's life, we hear about temples being destroyed and statues being moved. So it's a time of increasing Christian domination. And when he's very young still, his family moves to Lycia, which is their original homeland, right, in Asia Minor, today in Turkey. And his name, Proclus, means far from home, right? So they were probably really attached to the place. And we have a birth chart for him, which is interestingly cast not for a birth in Constantinople, but for Lycia. So it seems that like there was a real attachment of his parents to
So because he
to
wasn't born
Lycia
there,
and
his
not.
family was from there.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
his family was from there, but he wasn't born there. Yeah, he was born in Constantinople. Um, so his father was a lawyer, and at the beginning, when he was a teenager, like 13, he starts studying to also rhetoric to be a lawyer. He gets sent to Alexandria to do that. But then once during a trip to Constantinople with a professor of his, and Marinus describes him having very close relationships with his professors. He moves in with them. He's like a son to them and things. Once when he's traveling with a professor of his, he has a vision of a goddess that some people think it's Athena, some people think it's Hecate. It's not. Marinus doesn't specify it, and she tells him that he has to study philosophy, and she specifies also that he study it in Athens, but he doesn't do that. At first, he goes back to Alexandria and he starts studying philosophy and mathematics there, right? And especially his professors there teach Aristotelian philosophy, mainly, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
And he also has classes with mathematicians. But then 2 years later, he then fulfills the rest of the dream and he goes to Athens. And he makes a very big impression on the philosophers there, on the Platonists, in part because he has a very public piety, right? So he openly in the middle, as I said, there were still some temples functioning, but public worship was certainly not very done. And he, in the middle of the road, he bows down and worships the moon. And they're very impressed by this, and they're very impressed by his intellect. He very quickly studies through all of Aristotle and starts studying Plato, with first Plutarch, who was the head of the academy, but was already very old at the time when he arrived, and then with Syrianus, who was his successor. And then he studies with Syrianus another 5 years, and then when Syrianus dies at, I think Proclus is now about 27, if I'm not mistaken. Proclus becomes the head of the academy, and he is the head of the academy until the end of his life, so like for 50 years. And this was like a place where there was sacrifice happening, and so like there was, I mean, it was also like a cultic center. They would do rituals, and so it was not just like a philosophical center, it was also a religious center, the Platonic Academy at Athens, and it's also a center where we learn from Damascus that the people also studied mathematics there, right? So there's also a mathematics part of the curriculum. And although there was 1 year where he had apparently to flee the city and spend some time abroad because of some tensions probably with Christians, during most of his life he has no conflict with the Christians. So that's just a very broad sketch of the life, and there are some things here that are relevant for understanding the elements. So first of all, there's this mathematical component, which was part of his studies since Alexandria, and which continues in the academy. So Proclus has a few mathematical works. He writes a commentary on Euclid's Elements that has 2 prologues, which give his, so to speak, philosophy of mathematics, but then also a commentary on the first book, where he comments the axioms and the definitions, and then he talks about the proofs and how they work. He also has a text on astronomy, and which deals with 10 different astronomical problems. And he also wrote, on the model of Euclid's Elements, the Elements of Physics, which is a Euclidean presentation of Aristotle's theory of motion, from Physics Book 6 to Book 8. And it's a very polished work. It was very popular later in Latin, because people thought it was much easier to read this than to read Aristotle. So there's this strong mathematical component, and he has a great familiarity with this genre of elements, which the Elements of Theology is a part of, and I'll get to you there in a second about what that means. But first of all, let's talk about the theology part, right? So what is this theology he's talking about, right? Theologia. Now, theologia can mean about 3 different things in Proclus. Sometimes it's a word for inspired discourse. So he'll call Homer and Orpheus and Pythagoras, and also the authors of what are called the Chaldean oracles, which we might get to, are theologoi, right? They wrote things down that are inspired by the gods, right? Or sometimes, in the case of the Chaldean oracles, these are texts, oracular texts, that we only have because Neoplatonists quote them. The Neoplatonists say, the gods say that, and then quote the oracle, right? So that's one meaning of theology, right? Another meaning is discourse about the gods. So Proclus has a work called the Platonic Theology. It's probably what one would call his most advanced work in terms of his metaphysics, the most complicated one. And there his proposal is to organize everything that Plato says in his dialogues about the gods, right? And so here it's not just about individual gods, but also about like the hierarchy of gods, what is divinity. So here theology may be more in the sense that we use it, of discourse about God or about the gods. But then there's also a third meaning, which is it's a specific idea of a specific science, which is about how all beings depend on the first principle, right? Tohen, unity. We'll get to that. And so there it's closer to what people would often understand as metaphysics, right? It's a study of being itself, its general properties, and how it depends on a first principle. So these are three meanings of theology, and then the question is, what sense of theology do we have here, and how does Proclus understand his own theology? And in order to talk about that, I'm going to show you a bit about how Proclus understands the intellectual tradition he's a member of. And so I'm going to share a screen. Find this. Where is it? Should be. Oh. My screen disappeared. Okay, it's for some reason it doesn't let me show the photo app. Give me a second. I will fix this. There. Okay, you see that?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay, great. So there's this little tree here, and it represents basically the Platonic tradition as Proclus understands it. So one thing to understand is that there are many sources of authority that are prior to Plato. Orpheus, yes, the Orphic Rhapsodies that get down to him. Hesiod, he actually writes a commentary on the Works and Days that comes down to us. Homer, he has two essays in his commentary on Plato's Republic, which are about reconciling Plato and Homer, partially through allegorical interpretation, partially through other methods, and also Pythagoras. This is also recognized as someone prior to him. So all these things go down. But what separates Plato out, and the Neoplatonists and Proclus especially see Plato as some kind of divine revelation, this sharing by the gods about the knowledge of being and everything, is that Plato not only writes things that are inspired, that are divinely inspired, but that it's dialectical. By that, on the first level, that means that he gives arguments, right? It's not just that we have to find the arguments. Like in the case of Pythagoras or Homer, you might get one saying about divine things. For instance, that Zeus has these two jars that, and from one comes all evil things, and from one comes all good things, and then you can give a philosophical interpretation of that in terms of, say, limit and unlimited that constitute reality and that mix and make reality. But so everything that you learn from other theologians, there are arguments for those, but in Plato, the things come with the arguments. And what's more, in Plato, there's the project, which Proclus thinks has been realized by Plato, of a dialectical science. What does that mean? It's a science that starts, so this is just a project that's described in the Republic, book 6, of a science that starts from hypotheses, like mathematics does, simply stipulating things. But then by inquiring after these hypotheses, investigating them, criticizing them, it keeps going to higher and higher hypotheses until somehow, and then there's a leap here, it reaches something that's not a hypothesis at all, an unhypothetical starting point, a first principle. And then from that unhypothetical first principle, it proves all the hypotheses that it used previously, and it proves the starting points for all the sciences. Right? So this is like the Platonic dream of a science. Proclus doesn't think it's only a dream. He thinks Plato really did it, and that if you systematically interpret all the dialogues together, and especially the dialogue Parmenides, you can figure it out. But the light of Plato was too strong, and the people that succeeded him didn't manage to understand him and to carry it on. And so, for instance, there are the other Platonists that succeeded Plato in the academy, like his nephew Speusippus, and he gets criticized by Proclus. So these Platonists immediately after Plato aren't authorities for Proclus and other Platonists the way that Plato is. And an extra word about how Plato is an authority. So it's not just that everything he says is true, but that there's meaning in everything he does. So the choice of words, the order of words, the fact that he uses this word or not other words, how he sets up the dialogue. So even the setting and the characters all have some symbolic meaning. So everything is there to teach. So later Platonists don't have this same authority. And Aristotle, he's seen as someone who didn't understand his teacher Plato, but they call him daimonios, right? Spirit-like, semi-divine. And what does that mean? Well,
so Plato is divine and Aristotle is daimonis, or however you say.
Yeah. The daimonios, yeah. So they call it the divine Plato, and Aristotle is daimonios, yeah. So, and what does that mean? So daimones is in general the term for spirits that mediate between human beings and the gods. And they have many functions, but one specific function that they have is purification, right? They purify human beings so that they can enter into contact with the gods. And Aristotle actually has a function like that for Proclus and for other Neoplatonists. I'll get to what Neoplatonism is in a second. But so, as I said, there are Platonists after Plato that Proclus doesn't like. He thinks they have bad interpretations of Plato. Often they have too literal interpretations of Plato, right? So when Plato describes in the Timaeus the creation of the world as if it was this engineer that decides one day to start working and to make out of this chaotic matter an organized world, they think that that's all crass and vulgar, because actually the world is eternal, and what's being described as a process in time is actually only that being done that for didactic purposes. And where they get the idea that, I mean, who develops first a battery of arguments for the eternity of the world is Aristotle. So
and Aristotle
the idea
thought that Plato did mean it literally, right? Or more literally.
Yes. Yeah. But they think that what Aristotle's criticizing is just the vulgar interpretation of Plato, the literal interpretation. And so you have to use Aristotle and Aristotelian arguments to overcome the literal interpretation, right? And so that's the sense in which Aristotle has this purifying function for them. Also, I mentioned that in his studies, he first studies Aristotle and then Plato, and that was typical for the Platonic Academy, for the curriculum. You study Aristotle first, and that gives you the groundwork, and now you can study the real stuff, which is Plato. They called Aristotle the lesser mysteries and Plato the higher mysteries. So they disagree with Aristotle, and they think that actually Plato had in Plato's text you find answers to everything that Aristotle objects to, But nonetheless, you have this use of Aristotle with his purifying function. And then there are people, you know, who are worse than Aristotle. There are people who are like Stoics, which they thought that everything was body, right? That all beings are bodies. And there are people who Proclus hardly even deigns to mention, like Epicurists and atomists, who think that the world is atoms and void. And so this is even lower. But they have this idea that, you know, so like Plato is really gives the trunk of the philosophical tradition, and other people are just deviations. And in the 2nd century, there's Plotinus, right? And Plotinus is seen, there's a debate about to what degree for Proclus he's an innovator in every sense, but specifically for the case of theology, Plotinus is seen as the great recoverer of Plato, right? It's as if Plato is born again. It's very significant that from antiquity, the 2 philosophers that we have complete works handed down to us are Plato and Plotinus, right? Everybody else, it's incomplete. Proclus is incomplete. We have tons of text from Proclus, over 1 million words, but still it's incomplete. But Plotinus and Plato, we seem to have everything.
And even
so
something they didn't write, okay?
What?
And even some things they didn't write.
And even some things they didn't write, but so that's important to mention. So for Proclus and Platonists, Plotinus, they generally take most of these things that we think are spurious as authentic. They do have some misgivings about some texts. So Proclus already, I think, thinks that
One second, I'm going to start. About which?
Please.
Just tell me what to stop 1 second.
No, that's fine.
I'm sorry, I just. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, which text you were talking about?
The Epinomis. This is a dialogue that's supposed to complete the laws. And already in antiquity, it's ascribed actually to Philip of Opus, a student of Plato's. And so Proclus mentions this, that it's not authentic, but usually, so like many of the letters, or I think all the letters they take to be genuine, especially the 2nd letter talks about these 3 kings, and that's very, and they use that as a proof text for their metaphysics. And also first Alcibiades, that many scholars today think is spurious, they thought it was the first Platonic dialogue that you should read because it's about self-knowledge, and so it's the beginning of a philosophical inquiry. And yeah, so there's they took some things that we think are spurious, they took for authentic. Now, Plotinus's works are edited by Porphyry, right? And who also writes works of his own. He writes a commentary on the Timaeus. He writes and he writes a work called Philosophy from Oracles. He's a real scholar. Porphyry has access to lots of texts, lots of earlier Platonists, and he is trying to establish the truth of Plotinus' interpretation of Plato over that of earlier Platonists, and he succeeds in doing this, in establishing Plotinus as the Neoplatonist, of the correct interpretation of Plato. Let me talk here about what his interpretation of Plato is and what Neoplatonism is. So we use Neoplatonism to refer to these Platonists that come from Plotinus onward and that share the basic ideas of his metaphysics. They themselves just call themselves Platonists. Characterizing them as Neoplatonists is a 19th century category of German scholars. And then there's corresponding to that, then the Platonists that came before them, like Alcinous and others, are called Middle Platonists, right? But throughout antiquity, these people are just called Platonists, and they see themselves as such. Now, what's new with Plotinus? What's new with Plotinus is this idea that the first principle, right, of reality is tohen, usually translated as the one, but that can be misleading if it makes you think that it's one thing, that it's a determinate one individual that's the cause of all other things. I myself prefer calling it unity or unity itself, right? So this is just a very common Platonic way of talking. So when you want to talk about the abstract things, say unity or beauty, you talk about tohen, the one, or tokalon, the beautiful, right? But what they're talking about is the abstract principle. So tohen is what makes each thing one, what is responsible for things being one. And that's actually one of the reasons why it's a problem to think of it as an individual, because it's supposed to be the source of individuality. Is it then many? No, but and in general, Neoplatonists will say that it's very hard to talk about this, if not impossible. And they'll have a lot more things to say about what Plotinus called the second principle, which is nous, right? We talked about nous last time, this separately existing intelligible object that makes itself known, right? And Plotinus has lots to say about that. Before Plotinus, many Platonists said that nous was also the highest good and the first principle, and they were following their Aristotle too, who thinks that nous is the first principle. His first unmoved mover, he says, is nous, and it is nouisis noesios noesis. So it's thought, thinking, thinking, right? Thinking, thinking, thinking. So in Platonist found that Aristotle's account of nous was very thin, it's empty, it seems entirely self-referential. What does this nous know? Just itself. And it knows itself knowing itself. For Plotinus, it already has more content. It's actually the world of the forms that's making itself known, right? And all the content of all of Plato's forms are in there. And because it has all this rich content, this multitude of forms, and also it has this reflexive nature because it makes itself known, right? Then it's those are the reasons why Plotinus thinks it can't be the first principle, because Aristotle already thought that the first principle has to be simple, but he thought that nous was simple. Plotinus argues that it has to be complex, and that even in Aristotle's description it's complex. And so he says that they have to have a prior principle, which is this unity, this pure unity that is the cause of things being one. And so those are the first two principles of Plotinus, right? Unity and nous, and following nous then also psyche, soul or mind, right? Which is the cause then of life and things that move themselves, change themselves, responsible for their own change. And Plotinus' philosophy is, as it were, a guide for the soul to recognize its true nature. We should recognize that we are not bodies, that we are actually souls, that we're principles for the entire world. We're not subordinate to it, unlike in the Stoic cosmos, where we're just bodies, part of this mechanical bodily system, and we're entirely determined. No, we actually realize that we're above the world, and ultimately that for us to return to our Father, which is unity. So this is how Plotinus phrased it. And Plotinus, these general lines of Plotinus's philosophy are then shared by future Platonists, so that we call Neoplatonists: Porphyry, Iamblichus, Theurgy, Proclus. However, there's a number of opinions that Plotinus has that no one shares with him afterwards. So, for instance, he calls our soul and the soul of the world soul sisters because we're actually on the same level, and Proclus won't accept that. He thinks that there's a division here, that there's a hierarchy. The world soul is above ours. Later Platonists will introduce more higher principles, more complexity into the world of principles, into the intelligible world. There'll be things that mediate between unity and nous. These are new things. Plotinus thinks that the soul, the psyche, has a part of it that is always contemplating, that is up there with the intelligible things and always contemplates. And later Platonists, after Iamblichus, will deny that, and they'll say that no, when the soul descends, when the mind descends, it descends entirely into the body. There's not one part of us that is always there contemplating. So for Plotinus, the return of the soul is really a matter of realizing what's always happening. Whereas for later Neoplatonists, there's a real change here, right? We're really in the body. This is a great catastrophe, and we have to get out of it. And this leads to another difference, which is the question of theurgy, right? So theurgy, God work, literally, is the Neoplatonic term for ritual action and prayer, right? Because of their belief that in ritual action and prayer, it's the gods who are active, right? And in Plotinus, scholars have argued, and this especially Zeke Mazur, who died just a few years ago, that you actually do have some kind of ritualized activity in Plotinus, but they're all mental activities. So Plotinus and all later Neoplatonists have a very ascetic ethics, and they believe that you have to be pure in order to do metaphysics, in order to commune with the gods, in order to know the intelligible things. But besides that, in some passages of Plotinus, we find guidelines for, like, imagine this, then do that. Like, you imagine the whole world, then remove all bulk from it, then remove this, and then there's this guided meditation, so to speak, that's supposed to lead to insight. And people have pointed to that as some kind of ritual action, ritualized action. However, there isn't yet a privileged place in Plotinus for, say, bodily religious rituals involving ritual objects and special times and places. And he does recognize the gods, and where they are in his system, unclear. It seems sometimes that he calls nous God, or the gods, sometimes they're souls. So that's unclear, and there's nothing like a criticism of or a rejection of traditional religion or something like that. But it's not just very important to him, and it's also not important for Porphyry. It starts to become very important for Iamblichus, who's the same one who insists that the soul is descended entirely, and he is being very influenced by this group of texts, these Chaldean oracles, these oracles that are supposed to be from Hecate and Apollo, mainly. So these are the two gods that are very present there. And they are, these oracles are an answer to the catastrophe of embodiment, right? This human soul is embodied, it's found itself in uh, in the sensible world, and then they prescribe a number of techniques uh, um, of purifying things, of rituals, and also they have a very Platonic cosmology that then is supposed to guide the soul to how it can use the body and use bodily things to help it ascend back, right? And in general, so there's and and Iamblichus's main opponent, so to speak, Platonic opponent, is Porphyry. And Porphyry writes a text. It's a complicated situation here. Porphyry writes to a fictional Egyptian priest with a bunch of questions/objections about theurgy. How can it work? Aren't you forcing the gods to do something? Aren't you describing the gods as something that can be affected and that are subject to passions? How can one part of the world be more special than another? Like, how can there be special places? How does prophecy work? He has like all these questions/objections. And then Iamblichus writes a different work, which is best known today as On the Mysteries. That was the Latin title that was given to it by Marsilio Ficino. And he responds to all these, but he also takes on a persona as a higher Egyptian priest, as it were, the boss of the priest that Porphyry was writing to. And Iamblichus also is very important for the study of Plato. He is the one who sets down the curriculum. What are the 10 dialogues that you have to read when you start studying Plato? That goes from the Alcibiades to the Philebus, and then the 2 final extra dialogues that, as it were, summarize all of Plato's philosophy, the Timaeus and the Parmenides. So, and he also innovates by introducing the idea of the skopos, right? That each dialogue has one target, one aim, which so for instance for the Timaeus it would be physiologia, physics, and then everything in that dialogue, even the setting and the characters, have to be interpreted in light of that skopos. So for instance, the war of Atlantis, that's the myth of Atlantis that's told at the beginning of the Timaeus, is then interpreted as a myth, a symbol about the opposition between forces in nature and how they contribute to making nature. So forces of order, of ordering, of limit, and forces of chaos and unlimitedness. And so that's just an example. And then when we get to Proclus's commentaries on Plato, you often find that, so initially there's a text of Plato. And then first of all, there's an interpretation that's close to the text, but isn't metaphysically very exciting, right? The person who's noticed this pattern is Stephen Menn at McGill. And so it's not very exciting. It usually also has some moral interpretation, like what does this have to do with ethics and moral philosophy. And then there's another, and that interpretation is usually from Porphyry. And then there's an interpretation that's very metaphysical, but it's very far away from the text, and this is usually Iamblichus' interpretation. And then Proclus will then introduce a synthesizing interpretation, which manages to get lots of more metaphysical things from the text than Porphyry does, but is still much closer to the text than Iamblichus. And he usually attributes that to Syrianus, who was his immediate teacher, and he constantly presents his opinions as the opinions of his master, right? He calls him my master, my teacher, and it's very hard to separate the opinions of the two together. Indeed, Damascus, Proclus's last successor as head of the academy, in his work on the first principles, will sometimes just call both Proclus and Proclus and Syrianus together the philosophers. And the philosophers say this, right? That's on the one hand a sign of the authority that their interpretation of Plato had received within Platonism, and indeed from Marinus' hagiography, but also from Damascus's description of the pagan world at the time when Proclus was already an old man. Proclus really had become this authority known throughout the pagan world. People would travel there just to study with him. Damascus has this thing where he finds something bad to say about almost everyone. And so about Proclus, he also, even Proclus, who's practically a saint, even to Damascus' own teacher Isidore, he still manages to find something to say, and to say that Proclus cared more about theurgy, so ritual, than its natural counterpart, virtue. But anyway, so that's just a witness to how close Syrianus and Proclus were seen. They were even buried together, and also the authority that they had gotten. And so the Proclean Syrianic interpretation will always be some kind of synthesis between Porphyry and Iamblichus, managing to keep the big metaphysical stuff, the exciting stuff that Iamblichus talks about, but much closer to the text, the way that Porphyry does. And now what's really new with Proclus in all this is that he writes the Elements, right? And the Elements is going to be an introduction to this Platonic science about being and the gods that for newcomers, and it's going to be written not in the form of a commentary, right? And not appealing to any authorities, not appealing to the authority of Plato or even any other theological authorities, but merely standing on its own, right? It's a collection of 211 propositions. Later propositions depend on earlier propositions, and these are supposed to include the theorems of universal application, right? This is what is called elements in the strict sense. These are the theorems that are applied throughout the whole science. And it's an attempt to find out what is basic in this science and to break it down into its last elements. So, but before I get into that, and I talk more about the elements as a project, let me take a breather here and let you ask questions about this genealogy that I just presented.
Yeah, no, that was very clear. I don't know enough of the history to have questions about it. I would have questions about content, but maybe
okay.
You wanted to say something more, and then, or we should stop here, or then I'll.
No, I'll continue then. I just remembered also that I put here Julian in this.
Yeah, you didn't talk about that.
In this genealogy, and of course he's important for Platonists as the attempt to return to a pagan lifestyle. So Marinus's biography dates Proclus's birth and death to the reign of Julian, right? Mm-hmm. So that's seen as a before and after moment for them. And Julian was himself a Neoplatonist. He studied with a student of Iamblichus, I think, Maximus. He was really big into theurgy, and he's really unique in trying to give a political expression to Neoplatonic philosophy. But of course that Julian's attempt fails. He dies in battle very quickly, and in general, so there's this impression of Christian dominance at the time. Proclus hardly ever mentions Christians. When he does, he mentions it through code, like what most people think nowadays, and so on. And in general, he's very critical, but Proclus doesn't think that, oh, there were the good pagan old days, and now Christianity has come, it's this great catastrophe, and now everyone's atheist. No, he thinks that most people, right, this is from Plato, most people are evil. Most people are dominated by their emotions. They're not philosophers. Philosophy is reserved to an elite, not because that's good or because you don't want other people, but simply because people aren't made for that. And it's just natural. And they and even think this is just part of how the gods rule the world. And so there's, although that he is, of course, very critical of Christianity, probably if you asked him, if you like, what is the great evil of this time, it would be this rampant disbelief in the gods. But he also thinks that, you know, this is just the way that people are being stupid now, right? It's and always most people will be stupid. Um, so so that's that. So let me stop the screen share because I won't be talking about this anymore. Okay, and now I'm going to talk about the elements. So this is really what's new that Proclus brings, and he's probably maybe inspiring himself in the example maybe of Zeno and Parmenides. So I thought I had marked it here, but apparently I don't. So, okay. So in his commentary on Plato's Parmenides, which is a dialogue that Plato wrote, which stages a meeting between Socrates, Zeno, and Parmenides, right? So, and Parmenides, of course, wrote his poem where he presents being as entirely one, and then Zeno is known for his paradoxes. And then, so at the beginning, they talk about Zeno's arguments, and Socrates presents a form of the theory of ideas that Parmenides shoots down, gives a bunch of 6 different arguments against him, and Socrates can't solve them. And then Parmenides says, well, this is because you don't have experience in dialectics. So let's do an exercise. And I'll take you through a dialectical investigation about my own hypothesis that the one is, right, or unity is. And that's then the second part of the dialogue, where Parmenides goes through a number of deductions, which all start, if the one is, what are the consequences for the one? Or if the one is, what are the consequences for other things? And he does 9 deductions of this kind, and what's 5 of them start with if the one is, and the last 4 start with if the one is not, right? So seeing all the conclusions possible about the one, about things different from the one, starting from the hypothesis that either is or is not, and the conclusions all contradict each other. And so people have never known what to do with this dialogue. The Neoplatonists took this dialogue as where Plato presents his dialectic, right? His science that starts from an unhypothetical first principle. And they think that the different deductions describe different parts of reality. We won't go into detail about this, but so for instance, the first deduction starts with if the one is, and then denies every possible predicate of the one. It ends by saying that the one has no being, that it has no unity, that it even can't be known. And they think, so this is a description of the first principle of unity as the transcendent first principle of reality. And then the second one is then about it starts from if the one is, but then derives all possible predicates of the one. He even says that it's moving and that it's at rest, and that it touches things and doesn't touch them, that it's in time even. And then Neoplatonists will interpret this as about the intelligible world. Proclus and Syrians have a more specific interpretation that it's about the orders of the gods. But this detail we don't have to get into now. But so this is certainly the most important dialogue for them. But at the beginning, there's this exchange between Socrates and Zeno and Parmenides, and um, Socrates observes that in some sense that Zeno is saying the same thing as Parmenides, right? Because whereas Parmenides says that being is one, then Zeno shows the paradoxes that you get if you think that being is many. And Proclus, commenting on this, says, and Zeno is right to do so because you should not repeat exactly what your professor, what your masters say, what your teachers say. If you have to say it in a different form, because if you just repeat it, you'll be taking what they said for your own glory. So you should do that, say the same thing, but in a different way. And it could very well be that there's this kind of thought that he is going to innovate in the form of teaching by writing this Elements of theology and presenting it in this way. So, and of course, and as I said, he has this mathematical background. He knows and has studied this this genre, and this will be actually very important, one of Proclus's most influential texts, because it will get an Arabic monotheized version, right? And which then will get translated into Latin, called the Liber de Causis in Latin. And it's incredibly influential in Arabic and Latin-speaking philosophy. And the first person to notice that this is actually from Proclus is Thomas Aquinas, because William of Moerbeke translates Proclus's elements into Latin, and then Thomas says, "Aha! But this is obviously the same author. The Liber de Causis is different, but it's obviously depends on Proclus's text." So, and the Elements is really like the earliest example that we have of a metaphysics in this shape, right? And then it's also important for people later doing this. Even as early as Boethius in his De Hebdomadibus, which is this short text about the one, the good, he also takes this axiomatic approach, which starts with these 7 principles, and then he has this argument about the one, the good, about being in goodness. And so that might be like the first person inspired by Proclus in this Elements project. But what's important is that it's a project. So and as the project stands with us, it's incomplete. As I mentioned, there are 211 propositions, but there are no definitions and there are no axioms at the beginning. And these would be standard things for you to find at the beginning of an Elements. Furthermore, and as we read the text, we'll see this, all the propositions, they don't have the same style. At the beginning, we'll find propositions with a very resumed, a very compressed style with a small vocabulary, and that go very step by step. And so this is probably like the geometrical ideal. But then later we'll find propositions that are very rich in their style, that like use 3 synonymous expressions one after another for the same thing. And so there seems to be the idea that Proclus hasn't finished polishing this disc. He hasn't finished making it into an Elements. And that's probably a good reason why we don't have the axioms or the definitions, because the way you write a text like this is that you keep trying to prove everything that you can prove. And then at the end, the things that you haven't managed to prove, then those you list as your axioms and your definitions. There's a researcher at Leuven now who has this project of understanding the logical structure of the Elements. Athanasios, I'm blanking on his last name, who has argued that actually Elements is a bad translation for the name of the text, because it's Elements per se that translates stoicheia, which means these propositions that are of universal application within the science. But the name of the text in Greek is stoicheiosis. It's the action to elementarize something, to lay the groundwork for something, right? And there's in Proclus, and when Proclus comments on Euclid's elements, this is very important to him to see that there's an activity happening here behind the text. There's the architect of the text, the elementarizer, so to speak, who has decided on the order of the propositions and decided to present some things before others. This is really important, and we'll see this as we read it, about how it's this groundwork. Now, I see that we're getting close to the hour.
Yeah.
Let me then just talk a bit about the other part of the title, theology. So I already mentioned the three meanings of theology, and so about being and its dependence on the first principle, inspired discourse or discourse about the gods. So this isn't going to count as an inspired discourse, and it can be seen as about the dependence of being on the first principle, but also as being about the gods. Why? So it has two parts. The first part goes from proposition 1 to 112. And here we'll have universal propositions. This is the general metaphysics, right? So of the thing. So and then 113 to 211 is what we can call special metaphysics, because it'll be about mainly three things: gods, nous, and psyche. Souls, or in the case of Proclus, psyche are really minds, because their first function, their primary function, is thinking. They're separately existing realities that contemplate the forms. And then as an added activity, they also give life to bodies. But their main thing is this activity of knowing. So that's why psyche and Proclus are really minds. And so you might think, okay, so here we have first the general things, and then we have the specific things, and it seems like you're talking about, being in general, trying to give a general picture of being. However, if we talk about, there's also stuff that points to it to being especially, he's interested in the first principle. And we see this if we talk a bit about the structure of the first part, okay? So it starts with propositions 1 to 6. These are about unity, and that's what we'll be talking about next week, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an argument for unity as the principle of everything. Then 7 to 13, it's, as it were, another argument for the first principle, but this time as being the first cause, and as the good, and as unity altogether. Then 14 to 24, here he introduces the hierarchy of beings: bodies, minds, nous, unity. But there's also a sense in which he's now, we're learning something new about unity, because we learned that it's beyond each of these things, beyond bodies and minds and nous. And then we get into a number of propositions about causality, but we'll see that at in each of the sections above these, he's also interested in the principles that we can derive from these. So he's interested in principles like time itself, eternity itself, limit, unlimitedness, wholeness, and being, life. And so he's interested in reaching these principles, and also in understanding, knowing what can we know about the first principle, because it's beyond even these things. So I'll go over this structure of the text more with you at the beginning of next time, but for next time, we'll also discuss propositions 1 to 6 and the argument there. Okay.
Okay, so should I read it?
Yeah. Read 1 to 6
Mhm.
by next week. We can do it at the same time.
Yeah, I think so. I'll check
Okay.
my calendar, but should be okay. Do you mind if we spend some time discussing some stuff, or?
Yeah. I have
It's
some
already
time
11.
for us to discuss. Yeah. So I have a few minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. What did I want to say? A lot of things.
Right.
Yeah, I think we should try to leave whatever the schedule is. If we do an hour, and we can maybe do an hour and a half or so, but we should need time to, because there's a lot of stuff and I need to talk a little bit. So
I'm sorry. I
no,
just got caught
that's
up.
very
There
good.
was
It's just that I teach also and have the same problem. Forgetting what I wanted to talk about. Yeah, a few very general or overview
Sure.
level questions.
Sure.
Maybe they need a lot more things. One is you talked about the piety and worshiping the moon and stuff like that. So is there, I don't know, what is the relationship between sort of being a good pagan and being a philosopher? Because these things seem to, I mean, what is the, like, do they identify them as the same thing? Is it like how do these things
yeah.
work for them?
Yeah, I think that there are a few levels to this question. In one sense, prayer and ritual are the culmination of philosophy, because they so I mean, intellectual study will teach you that you are really a mind, and to separate yourself from bodily pleasures, and it will give you and it will fill your life with this activity of knowing eternal things. But in order for you to act in the world and not just withdraw from it, the way that you can act in the world together with eternal things is through prayer and ritual. So in a sense, prayer and ritual is how then the philosopher then comes back from his contemplation and acts in the world. And these prayers and rituals can have spiritual effects. They can be for illumination, but they can also be for very practical things. So Marinus tells us that he ended a drought in Attica through his rituals. And so that's one thing. On another level, they see, as I said, Plato's philosophy is a gift from the gods, right? So it's like really soaked into it. And of course, if once you're reading in this way, you'll notice that gods are mentioned all the time in Plato's dialogues, right? And so it's of course there are skeptical interpretations of Plato, and there are other ways of taking this, but if you have like your pagan eyes on, then you'll find this. So I think that piety, I think piety is on the one hand, it's really mixed up with philosophy, like they see philosophy as kind of divine gift. On the other hand, it's just a virtue. It's like part of what makes you a good person. You sacrifice to the gods, you pay your debts, right? And so they think actually that the problem of one of the problems of Christianity is that it recognizes the first cause, but it destroys all the mediating entities, everything that would help us, that would help mediate the gap between human beings and the first cause, is removed. All these heroes and spirits, and then you don't have, and then moral progress is impossible, right? And that's at least
Because, well,
how
then
he
that's why
talks
they
about
have
people
Jesus,
who,
isn't that?
well, yeah, but but that's why they have Jesus, and that's how Christians would respond. I don't think that Proclus would be impressed, but yes, that's how they. But so yeah, and he also has intellectual arguments for why there should be many gods. He has arguments for why there have to be many different levels of being, and he has argument why each level of being has to have its own god or its own group of gods. That's the cause of it. So yeah, that's the
So let me,
connection.
that's good. That's very good. Let me specify my question in two more ways. If you have time, if you don't have time, then let's do another time.
No, we can talk a bit more.
Number one, what is the kind of like we talk about revelation versus the thought or human thought. Socrates talked about it, right? About having the human knowledge and not divine knowledge and so on. Yeah. So what are these? It's like, how do they actually think that Plato's arguments are really revelation and not really doing arguments? Is that what they're saying?
No, they think they're revealed arguments.
What does that even mean?
Well, I don't know, like I mean, even in the Bible, sometimes you'll have a very simple argument of oh, I don't know, like why should Miriam go outside the camp? Because if someone insulted their father, then they should. Then even with the Calva Homer, that should.
Right.
So that's an argument in a revealed text, and they think that Plato has, of course, much more complex arguments and much more developed ones, but they're also revealed arguments.
The question is about authority, I guess, right? If you speak about argument, then ultimately the authority is human mind. If you think about a text, and if you think about revelation, then the authority would be because it says so in the text. So sort of what is the position on the Jerusalem Athens question, that the way that the medievals or moderns like to frame things?
Yeah. So I mean, so with regard to Plato, it's himself, there isn't that much problem with the Jerusalem Athens, because then it's just one document. But of course, the problem is that there is, so to speak, a Jerusalem Athens questions with, for instance, Homer, and of course, Homer presents the gods behaving badly, right? He presents them behaving like human beings, and as if they had bodies and things. And of course, and Plato himself criticizes all this in the Republic especially. But Proclus observes that Plato also often quotes Homer as an authority. So how do you reconcile these things? And there are two levels, basically. On the one level, and this is the part that people usually gloss over, the gods intentionally have inspired the poet with images that will deceive most people. The gods, the purpose of the myth is to hide the truth, is to convey the truth for the elite, the philosophers that can grasp it. But for most people, it hides it because it puts it in this mythical costume, and it's actually bad for them. But the philosopher, he can then interpret these things allegorically, right, from the perspective of knowing what he knows about what gods must be like through Plato, and then they can interpret this allegorically. There's also a different, right? I understand that you're also asking me.
Yeah, just to be clear. Just to be clear, like for example, if you read Maimonides, then you have the abstraction of God being explicitly acknowledged as something whose source is human wisdom, and then forces us to reinterpret the Bible because it must be true. And if you're a Neoplatonist, then you have a better situation because the abstraction is also considered to be divine revelation, and then we do just have to reconcile two different sort of revelations. Is that correct?
Exactly. And even when, for instance, if someone were alone without not through Plato to reach these conclusions of abstraction, this would be seen as a private divine revelation of that person.
Okay.
Right. So because they don't see I think when you get to the point of knowing the forms and knowing things like unity, not human knowledge can only happen with divine cooperation. Right. So so it's built into their epistemology that way.
Right. With knowledge. Yeah. And now the second thing you said about let me see. So about Homer or things like that being prophecy or something like that, which are then harmful, or is it on net harmful, or is it just harmful? Because again, if you read the Rambam, then he has something like, well, yeah, the Bible might give you some bad ideas, but on net, he seems to be, at least in context, it was beneficial because it's better than whatever else they were believing, or something like that.
No, no. The idea is, so this is part of Proclus's explanation of evil, that most human beings have to be evil in order for there to be animals, right? Because they have to be reborn as animals, and only evil people become animals. So the gods have to make sure that most people are evil. And one way they do this is through these myths that lead most people astray. So yeah, they are harmful.
So that would be
the
very
surface is
different
harmful.
So that kind of thing would be very different from what, I don't know about, maybe there's some Kabbalist that says something like that, but generally Jews would assume that the Bible isn't actively making things worse. I mean, hopefully.
Yeah, well, it's part of, it's because, you know, it's ultimately for the best, because the fact that there are all these different animals is part of what makes the world perfect. And it's also part of the conviction that this is the perfect world. There is no future world where everything will be fixed, right? This, how things are now, is perfect, right? So that's part of it as well.
Okay. I'm just
one moment, I just have to answer something here, and then you can ask your question. Okay. Where so you had the last question.
Yeah, you're here once. Yeah, maybe just give me like where to look. You mentioned it also, the daimonic or daimons or whatever those things are.
Yeah.
Because I've been studying something in different context that was referring to that. What my question is, I don't know, could you tell me more about that, or like where should I look to find out more about that? Like, are these like sort of like, firstly, is there like a relation between daimon and demon in the like Latin Christian world, or is the same thing, or is it kind of that?
So it's I mean it's this, so daimon originally, so in Homer, for instance, it's almost a synonym of theos, of God. In Plato, you get this first idea that daimones are actually something different. They're these mediators, these spirits that mediate between, messengers, but also do other things. He calls Eros a daimon, right? So love is a daimon, and he talks about them as revealing the different arts and crafts to human beings, and as shepherds of as shepherds of living beings and things. They're also, you know, associated with like daimones are like these the god that's responsible for this forest or for this spring and things like that. So but so there develops then later this idea that they're like these lower gods, these mediating entities. And yeah, because they're a word that that pagans use for their gods, Christians then use this word later for demons, because they think that the gods are demons, right? The gods of the pagans are demons, right?
And the pagans sort of agree.
And so,
I mean, depending on what kind of hierarchy are being, there are lower gods which are sort of demons. Or
I
don't know what the Christians, meaning to say.
So I mean, Christians won't think that daimones are gods, right? Their typical theory is that demons are fallen angels.
Right. Okay, that's a sort of different theory. But if you think of how would I say? If you think of there being some sort of hierarchy of gods or angels or whatever that is, then on the basic point, the a monotheist or believes in angels and stuff like that are sort of an agreement on the reality. It's just a question of what kind of worship or something.
Right,
like that.
exactly. So I mean, the idea that there's this hierarchy of mediating spirits is common, and then the term angel becomes the standard one in Christians, but that's really special because, of course, angel, angelos, originally means messenger. And then there's this idea that all the mediating entities, I mean, they have different functions, and especially Pseudo Dionysius, who systematized the Christian hierarchy, used Proclus's scheme for organizing the Greek gods, to organize the angels. But because angel is the main term, it's because there's the idea that all the mediating entities, ultimately, they're supposed to just be messengers of the true God. Whereas there is one special kind of daimon for Proclus, which is called angelos, which is called angel. But so that's just one function, right? And there's no idea that being a messenger is a paradigmatic function of them, you know. And there's no idea of evil daimonis. I mean, there might be daimonis whose function is to draw human beings closer to matter, and so they might be bad for us. But a daimon or a god with an evil will is something that's inconceivable for Proclus.
That's definitely a Christian idea, right? Because you wouldn't have that merely in, I mean, because I was reading what's his name, Avram Herrera, who tries to do like a synthesis of Plato and Lyria and something like that. And he was talking about, so he seems to be struggling with Klipot, and he seems to say, well, this seems to be this entire hierarchy of like angels, or what Yechezkel talks about, seems to what the Platonists talk about, levels of diamonds and stuff like that. And he says, well, the evil ones are just the ones which cause people to want material stuff, and they're evil. Well, like I say, I don't know in what exact sense they're evil. They're evil in the sense of concealing the mind or the thought, or something like that.
So they're evil for us. Yeah. So I mean, Prox would say they're evil for us, for human beings, but cosmically they're serving a good function. He compares them to people who would stay at the border, that would guard a temple, and that would keep unclean people from coming in. And so
can you tell me where that is?
Daimonists that draw people to, I'm sure that's in on the existence of evils, paragraph 55, I think. I can confirm that for you.
Okay, if you can send me, because I want to. Okay.
Yeah. So he talks about this. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's good.
So yeah. Okay. So I'm sorry there wasn't much time for questions this time.
Yeah,
I have something now at 12:30.
Okay. Thank
but
you so
next
much.
time I'll make sure that there's more. Okay. And
Yes,
if you have any questions during the week, you can send it to me too. Like and now as well, if you can just send it to me by WhatsApp or email.
Yeah, no problem. I'll just want to. I feel like I need to learn more. Just.
Okay. Great.
I will.
Okay. Well,
I will.
have a great week. See you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much.